Hello, folks, and welcome to our Wednesday, December 15th talk with Alison Cariens of the Strauss Center at the Harvard Art Museums. You may remember Alison joined us last year for a talk about the reds of the Forbes Pigment Collection, and we're back this year as part of our Blue 2021 exhibit, juried by Jessica May of deCordova and the Trustees, to learn more about the blues of the Harvard Pigment Collection. And so I'm happy to be joined by Alison Cariens and also our Associate Director, Candace Bankeri. We are recording this, and we do ask folks to remain on mute for the presentation portion of this talk. There will be plenty of time for questions. If you have questions while Alison is presenting, you can drop them into the chat, and we'll have time at the end to address those. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Alison to get the talk underway.
Great, thank you, Erin. Thank you to everyone for coming. Before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that the Harvard Art Museums acknowledges that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we strive to honor and respect this relationship. So to get started, I wanted to go over a very brief history of the Forbes Pigment Collection and how it came to be, as that's still a really critical part of its function. And then we will get into the blues. So Edward Waldo Forbes was born in 1873 into two very prestigious Boston families. He's the grandson of Jonathan Murray Forbes, the railroad magnate, as well as Ralph Waldo Emerson, the poet. And his father was the co-founder of the Bell Telephone Company. He was educated at Milton Academy and Harvard University. And following his time at Harvard, he traveled Europe to study art history, specifically Italian painting. Following a series of lecture positions at his high school and college alma maters, Forbes became, sorry, I lost my screen. Forbes became the second director of the Fogg Museum of Art at Harvard University. The museum was founded only 13 years before his appointment as director, and it grew exponentially under Forbes' tenure. This included the construction of an entirely new building, which you can see here. That is where the Harvard Art Museums reside today. He undertook massive fundraising campaigns and vastly expanded the art collection. As much of the early Fogg collection was comprised of study copies and plaster casts, which was pretty typical for museums in North America at that time. Much of the collection growth was accomplished through Forbes purchasing works of art in his personal collection and installing them as long-term loans in the Fogg. In this endeavor, Forbes often encountered works for auction in Europe that were either inexpertly restored, in incredibly poor condition, or both. He quickly realized that to properly preserve and care for these original treasures, he needed to have a deep understanding of the material and processes by which they had been made. He described this period as saying, "I somehow stumbled upon my special field." In addition to works of original art, Forbes also began collecting samples of the various materials used in the creation of art, notably pigments. He believed that close looking for students and scientists was the only way to truly learn about art, a message that still dictates the museum's mission statement today. In the classroom, Forbes began teaching what would become known colloquially as his egg and plaster class. The formal name was Methods and Processes of Italian Painting. At the Fogg, with the hiring of chemist John Rutherford Gettins, Forbes founded the Department of Technical Research in 1928, which is also the official start date for the Forbes Pigment Collection, as well as its sister collection, the Gettins Collection of Artist Media. Modeled on the emerging conservation departments he had seen in Europe, this facility was the first of its kind in North America. Shortly thereafter, Forbes hired art historian George Stout, who can be seen on the right. Gettins is there on the left. George Stout became the FOG's first conservator. Together, Stout and Gettins pioneered three major areas of art conservation: rudiments, degradation, and reparations, effectively bringing art conservation into the world of modern science. It was in this first area, rudiments, that Forbes' massive collection of pigments found their home and true purpose. Through technical analysis, Gettins was able to use these pigments to develop technical standards, as well as study the way materials behaved in specific conditions. While it is undoubtedly beautiful and an incredible testament to art making throughout history, the primary function of the Forbes Pigment Collection today is still as that set of analytical standards, just as they were used by Gettins. In fact, we still have his cabinet of tests and samples that you see behind him in the picture where he's looking at the camera. We still have that in our lab today, and it's still very much in use. Now, on to the blues of the Forbes Pigment Collection. Blue is an incredible color. It is both incredibly ubiquitous and incredibly rare. It is one of the most common colors in our everyday we live on the blue planet and we gaze up at the blue sky, but it is incredibly rare in nature. And this is due to physics, chemistry, as well as biology. Essentially, to reflect blue, molecule needs to be a very large structure, which requires an immense amount of energy in order to absorb the lowest energy light wavelengths, which are red. And then biologically, it needs to develop very specific physical structures, say in a feather or scales, to reflect back only high strength wavelengths of light, which are blue. And because of the amount of effort and the rarity of molecular structures in the elements on Earth that reflect blue back, it is an incredibly rare and prized color to find in the natural world. Egyptian blue is our first blue for the day. We'll start at the start where we ought to begin. Egyptian blue is the oldest known synthetic pigment. It was used by Egyptians as early as 2600 BCE, and it became the main source of blue pigment throughout the Roman periods of Egypt and was produced throughout the Near East and Mediterranean, all the way up until the 4th century CE. It even appears on the walls in Pompeii. However, despite this ubiquity, by the 9th century CE, all instructions for its production were lost and forgotten. The pigment was essentially unknown at that point. It was rediscovered in the 1800s, and known examples were studied to establish its composition. It is created using quartz, copper, alkali, and lime at extremely high temperatures of 1000 degrees Celsius, maintained for several hours. This pigment is incredibly interesting to me because, similarly to the other achievements of Egyptian society, such as the building of the pyramids, it remains a mystery how they were able to achieve this without modern technology. Just as building a pyramid is conceivable with contemporary machinery, heating materials at such a high and consistent temperature for hours is relatively simple with our modern convection ovens, but nearly inconceivable using only the kilns we know Egyptians to have had. Natural ultramarine is perhaps the quintessential blue up until the 19th century. It is made by crushing the mineral lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone largely mined in Afghanistan, almost primarily mined in Afghanistan. The color is concentrated by kneading the powdered lapis lazuli into a putty of wax and pine resin and subjecting it to an alkaline solution, which over a period of 30 days or so causes the blue particles, which are, as we said, larger in molecular structure, to drop out of the putty into the bottom of a container. This process is repeated over and over again, yielding weaker and weaker blue particles, ending up with what is called ultramarine ash, which is valuable as a glaze. You can see here the variety in colors that you can get in true ultramarine. So on the left, the upper left, we have ultramarine ash, and on the right, we have ultramarine made from lapis lazuli. And you can see that while both are authentic ultramarine, they are very different colors. And that demonstrates how pigment and color are not synonymous. Often people associate ultramarine having to look a very specific way because that is the name of a color. But a pigment is actually named for its chemical structure and not necessarily for its outward appearance. So two things can be true ultramarine and look very different from each other. Now, ultramarine was very popular in Venice, as well as other major nautical centers, which would explain Titian's extraordinary deployment of it in his paintings, such as the entire sky of his painting Bacchus and Ariadne. However, in general, the high cost of this rare pigment meant that it was reserved for only the most prized subjects and commissions, as it was more expensive than gold at the time and often required its own separate line item in budgets. That was until the synthetic analog ultramarine was developed in 1826 and sold commercially in 1828 as a cheap, readily accessible, and chemically identical alternative. In addition to its use as a pigment, it is sold as laundry bluing and enhances the whiteness of fabrics. Synthetic ultramarine is one of the best documented pigment developments, probably because its invention was requested of chemists and not the result of accidental or independent research. In 1924, the Société d'Encouragement offered a prize of 6,000 francs to anyone who could produce a satisfactory synthesis of ultramarine that would not cost more than 300 francs per kilo to produce. The first several years of this competition, all submissions were rejected as they were based off of the composition of Prussian blue or cobalt, and they were not a chemical facsimile of the precious stone. But in 1828, the prize was officially awarded to Jean-Baptiste Guamet, who submitted based on a process he had developed in secret in 1826. His ultramarine, which became known as French ultramarine, was sold for 400 francs per pound at a time when lapis lazuli cost between 3,000 and 5,000 francs per pound. This development was revolutionary in the art world and is a formulation still in use today. The next pigment we'll discuss is smalt or cobalt blue. Smalt is a pigment made from cobalt blue glass, and it has been known and utilized since at least the Middle Ages. However, the cobalt blue we use today was not established until the 19th century, and it was greatly improved and significantly more stable. Because of the prohibitive cost of making ultramarine, the Napoleonic administration commissioned various chemists and artists to find a cheaper solution. In 1802, Louis-Jacques Thenard, an industrial chemist, was able to create the pigment cobalt blue using a combination of cobalt salts and alumina as found in smalt. And this was a process that he actually borrowed from potters, as they used smalt to create vibrant blue glazes on their pottery. Prussian blue is the first synthetic pigment with a documented introduction date. That is 1704. It was synthesized by Diesbach in Berlin and is sometimes called Berlin blue. It also has a really fantastic, though not substantiated, origin story by which a professional dyer was in a rush to create a batch of cochineal dye for a client and had run out of potash, but found potash in the corner that was contaminated with animal blood, and that it was the combination of the iron in the blood with the ferric acid that accidentally created Prussian blue. However, that is kind of an urban legend, and it's not certain at all, although I do like the story. It was easily made, non-toxic, and highly affordable. Prussian blue quickly attracted many applications. As a pigment in paint, it became popular almost immediately and is present in the skies of Canaletto's paintings, in many Japanese woodblock prints, especially in areas where the sky fades from deep to light blue. The pigment is extremely light absorbing and the particles are very small, giving the unbound powder a deep velvety appearance. It is Prussian blue that forms with the absorption of light on cyanotypes, lending them their colloquial name blueprints. And in the 20th century, this textural light absorbing quality continues to be used in different ways by artists such as Anish Kapoor. Beyond its use in art creation, Prussian blue is a unique pigment in our collection in that it also is the only one that appears on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. Due to its unique and highly absorbent molecular structure, it can be used as a treatment for certain heavy metal and radioactive materials. This is due to its structure that allows it to form its ability to bond with valence, which bonds to the offending materials and isolates them from human tissue and allows them to be passed through the digestive system. This cuts the time spent in the human body by a third, I believe, and drastically reduces the person's exposure to radiation and heavy metals. It can also still be found today in cosmetics and laundry detergent, along with synthetic ultramarine. Our next, I apologize. Our next blue is Azarite, which is a semi-precious stone. It appears somewhat similar to lapis lazuli and was also used as a blue pigment. It was used in Europe as a cheaper, more readily available alternative to ultramarine blue, though its color was not nearly as vivid and it was not nearly as bright and would often darken to almost black when mixed with any sort of binder. So it's often formed within and around and alongside a chemically similar green mineral called malachite. And you can see we have a sample in the upper right of azurite with malachite inclusions. Malachite is also used as a pigment on its own. So the tendency to blacken when mixed with a binder could be seen in portraits in our collection. There's a portrait by Bronzino, which long had a bodice believed to be black, And it was only through technical analysis that it was revealed that it was actually Azarite. And in Japan, Azarite is ground to different size particles, with the largest being the darkest blue and the finest being lighter in color. You can see two really great examples of that. The small tube that has Japanese writing on it is Azarite ground very finely and is significantly lighter than the bottle to its left, which has large particles. And this is a really great demonstration of an overall tradition in Japan, where instead of combining white into pigment or paints, Japanese artists would create shading by varying the particle size of their pigments, which is really unique. Next, we have indigo. It is among the oldest dyes to be used for textile dyeing or printing. This deep blue pigment can be derived from a variety of plants found in Europe, Egypt, China, Japan, and pre-Columbian Mexico. The pigment is found throughout time and place and is incredibly unique in that it is one of the only pigments that the same pigment can be created from a large variety of sources. So you can actually get chemically true indigo from a pretty large variety of plants. And because of this ubiquity, it's held significant cultural and functional roles throughout time and across the world. One really small example of this and its effect over time is the use of indigo throughout Africa as a highly valuable and spiritually significant dye. It was very valuable, and cloth dyed with indigo was often used as a form of currency in various West African countries. It was also a major part of North African culture. The Berber culture were often called the blue men of Morocco because they wore so much indigo and worked with it so much that their skin was often tinted blue. And they also, in Morocco, still have the Blue City. And once, unfortunately, enslaved peoples were brought over to the United States, they brought with them the skill set to successfully cultivate indigo, which attempts had been made in the United States to grow indigo previously, but were not particularly successful. But the knowledge brought over from these enslaved peoples made it rapidly one of the largest cash crops in pre-revolutionary America. The spiritual significance remained and became associated amongst these diaspora communities with warding off evil, as evil spirits cannot cross water. And this was found in voodoo belief systems, but also various other African diaspora and Haitian belief systems. And because of indigo's resemblance to water, it would prevent evil spirits from entering your home. And so it proliferated amongst their homes, and they would paint things like their door frames and their windowsills to keep evil out. And over time, this was adapted by the enslavers, and they would utilize it as well. And they kind of co-opted the narrative to be that instead of evil spirits, what it would ward off was bugs. And that is the reason why, that's the source of what's called haint blue, which is the reason why porches are painted blue in so much of the American South. Now, some people call it Carolina blue, but it's just fascinating to me that you can trace over time all these different links throughout human history and what led to things such as people painting their porches blue to this day. So Marco Polo was the first European to report on the preparation of indigo in 13th century India. And though synthetic indigo became available after 1870, the traditional methods of indigo preparation have still been kept very much alive across the world, particularly in Japan, in printing, as well as in Mexican Zapotec weaving. And the example to the left of the screen, anil, which is that is the name for a plant from which indigo is derived in Mexico, are samples that we received from Porfirio Gutierrez. Him and his family live in Oaxaca, Mexico, and have been practicing traditional Zapotec weaving and dyeing. And it's been passed down in their family consistently, and they still maintain the same practices to this day. And so he was really generous in donating samples of their raw materials as well as their dyed yarn that have been used in Zapotec weaving for centuries. It is authentic indigo is also still found in denim manufacture, as I'm sure is not a surprise to anyone. So though the Forbes Pigment Collection is best known for our historical specimens, our collection is constantly growing and contains many really exciting, recently created innovative pigments. One of those is Yinmen Blue, which you can see on the upper left, and the tube of paint called Oregon Blue below it was made using Yinmen Blue. This is an organic pigment that was discovered accidentally in 2009 and became available and to the wider knowledge of the public in about 2015. It was discovered by Mas Subramanian and his graduate student Andrew Smith at Oregon State University. He was combining various metals and heating them to create conductors. And he combined yttrium, indium, and manganese and heated them. And what came out was this ultramarine blue powder that was incredibly stable and non-toxic. And it is actually really surprising that he immediately recognized its possibilities as a pigment, despite never having worked in the art industry or with pigments previously. He'd only been a material scientist, and they were doing work on conductivity of metals. This is actually the first brand new synthetic pigment in about 200 years. And it is the first synthetic blue or synthetic ultramarine. Well, it's not ultramarine, but it's the first synthetic blue that's been developed in centuries. And considering the incredible efforts and struggle to create synthetic blue pigments previously, it's a really shocking incidental discovery. Additionally, we have, you can see to your right, a DNA model that is purple, as well as a small vial of dye. And that is actually something called Void, which was developed by Faber Futures with Ginkgo Bioworks. And it is the first pigment that contains DNA. And it contains DNA that essentially is a roadmap for how it's created. And I would be lying if I said that I understand the science behind it, but it is a really stunning creation. And so these new pigments are not only really exciting and fascinating, but they're also unlocking different approaches to color and science, and they have really great potential in the world beyond the creation of art. For example, Yinmen Blue is absorbent of red light in a way that it absorbs heat as well and disperses it without heating up what is below it. And so it has incredible potential for keeping shelters cool in sunny climates and could go a long way in minimizing energy costs for cooling buildings. To celebrate these incredible achievements in blue, Crayola actually launched a crayon that through a survey campaign, they decided to name Bluetiful. And we actually were sent that crayon and we added it to the pigment collection to mark this significant cultural event. And our director, Narayan Kandekar, spoke at the launch event for the Crayola Bluetiful crayon. It is not made using any of these new pigments, but is more a symbolic gesture to mark this historic event. And that is all I have for now. I would love to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Alison. That was great. I'm just going to read some questions we have for you. That was extremely fascinating on so many levels. All the different
Thank you.
uses of the color blue, and even from a cultural standpoint, which we also talked about with the color red last time.
Yeah, well, and I feel like I barely touched on the different, I mean, there's that just one story. It's just so incredibly culturally significant, even in language development. All different cultures use the color blue in their language symbolically in all different ways. So, and it's contradictory all over the place. Even in English, blue skies ahead is incredibly positive, but having the blues is negative. It can mean everything. And there's something that I think people find really spiritual about that, is it's kind of all encompassing.
Yeah. I do want to get to some folks' questions. Yes. The first question we have from Paul. Paul's more or less asking about how the collection is, how or if the collection is actively used. He says, I see that your title includes conservation. Do you use / allocate the pigments of artwork for conservation purposes? Excuse me, for conservation purposes.
So that's a really great question. The pigment collection is actively in use as almost like a library of sorts. It is essentially a set of samples and standards that we can test against to confirm or research questions. These pigments are never used in the actual conservation of art. That is because part of the founding methodology initially set up by Gettens and Stout is that you do not want to do anything in conservation that cannot be undone or could be mistaken as being by the artist's original hand. And so that means that if we are going to fill in an area of loss in a painting that is blue, and the artist originally used Azarite, we will use an acrylic paint that is not Azarite, that is often water soluble, to make that infill. That way, if tastes change, if the curator's opinion changes, or if the work we did fades or becomes otherwise damaged over time, the work of the conservator can be removed without any damage to the original work of art. And if for some reason down the line, all knowledge that this conservation work was ever done is lost, but an analytical scientist takes a look at the work of art, they will be able to see immediately that this is not part of the original work. So for that reason, the pigments are not used.
So it's a way to kind of identify or distinguish the work of a conservator versus the work of the original artist.
Yeah, to distinguish, but also preserve the original piece, because you don't want, if you decide to remove your work later, you don't want to accidentally remove some of the original.
Right. That's interesting. Okay, so a next question we have from Deborah is, what is the name of the blue made with DNA?
Oh, it's called Void.
Hmm.
It's created by Faber Futures.
Void as in V-O-I-D.
VOID.
And this is just a comment, but I guess Ted was saying that the development of the pure blue LED was also an accidental discovery. Is that correct, or do you know that?
I don't know anything about LED lights. That is completely outside of my wheelhouse. I know LEDs are used in art making, but it's just not something we have represented in our materials collection. But I would certainly believe that.
And another question is it possible for people to visit the Forbes collection?
So you can view the Forbes collection at a distance on the 4th floor of Harvard Art Museums. It is behind a completely glass wall in glass cabinets, and so is visible from across the courtyard. And in the public space, we also have a case where we have a rotating collection of features from the Pigment Collection, so you can have a closer look at certain pieces that we've selected. And beyond that, we also have an audio tour created by myself and our director, Narayan Kandekar, on our website. And visits to the Forbes Pigment Collection are possible with a distinct educational or research purpose in non-pandemic times. Currently, we are not doing any, but previous and eventually, we are willing to host people or small groups for educational purposes.
Great. Great.
And there are instructions on how to do that on our website in the frequently asked questions category. It's essentially just contacting me.
So have obviously pre-pandemic times, have you hosted a lot of groups, at least tours like that?
Yes,
Or do you get a lot of requests to?
Yeah, we do get a lot of requests, and we would have groups of students and researchers come in fairly regularly, at least a few times a month. And it's been all sorts of different people. It's been research teams from several different apparel and sneaker companies. It has been different classes from Harvard and from outside Harvard, both art classes, but also classes. There are classes based totally on color and the significance of color in the world. We've also had geology classes come in. It really does run the gamut. Pigment is very applicable to many different fields.
And I'm sure anthropology classes, correct? Or
I actually don't know that I've had that many anthropology classes, which is kind of interesting.
A pitch for the anthropologist to contact you.
Yeah, I think it would be highly applicable.
Yeah. Great. Well, it sounds like, I guess we do have a couple more questions. Ted was asking, does the collection have any Japanese agami pigment from Asiatic dayflowers? Apologies if I'm saying it wrong. Or if you do not know, I can also, Ted, if you want to ask your question directly.
Yeah. So before Prussian Blue was imported to Japan, the ukiyo-e printmakers would use Asiatic dayflowers which is actually a weed in the eastern United States, to create a blue. It's a very delicate pigment. You have to be very careful with it. But I didn't know if the Forbes collection might have some of it.
I do believe we do. We have actually a really large group of Japanese pigments, historic and contemporary. And a big part of that was that Forbes's brother was the ambassador to Japan in the 1930s. And so he had his brother, as well as various friends, gather pigments for him. And so I do believe we have a small sample of the Dayflower pigment, as well as several other blues. There are a few that are still mysterious to us, and we are working with our Japanese curator for her help translating the labels. But a lot of them have colloquial names and not any sort of chemical structure name or proprietary name. And so it's been a journey.
Well, a lot of this stuff is basically, rural knowledge, or just, knowledge of the land or stuff like that, and was never really written down or talked about in a scientific way.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and people didn't always call things the same thing. They may have been chemically the same pigment, but they didn't go by the same name in two places.
Right. And then one last question, which I think is a great one, and I'm very interested in this, is do you have any recommendations for like books about the history of pigments, or any resources about kind of this information?
Yes, so there are a lot of really fantastic books. The first, which I'll plug because it directly involves us, is called An Atlas of Rare and Familiar Color. And that is specifically about the Forbes Pigment Collection. That came out in 2017. And I believe it's still being distributed. And then we have, there's Painting Materials, which is the original encyclopedia written by Rutherford and Stout, which is a bit of a deep dive, but is really interesting. There's also a few different books by a woman named Victoria Finlay, spelled Finlay, that I've really enjoyed. One, I believe, is just called Color, and she has several others. There's a lot of different really great books. Those are some of the ones I've really enjoyed. There is also a book that has come out all about blue. Let me find, sorry.
Sure.
I believe that actually just came out this year. It is called Blue: In Search of Nature's Rarest Color. And it is by Kai Kupferschmidt. And that is a really fascinating book. And I listened to a really lengthy interview with the author as well. And he dives into blue and its scientific presence in the world, biological, chemical, physical. And then he also delves into its use all around the world in historic and contemporary culture, including in architecture and art and spiritually. It's a huge compendium of knowledge on blue specifically, and not just blue pigment.
Great.
So yeah, there are lots and lots of books that are really fantastic.
It's great to hear that there's an entire one on blue.
Yeah.
I'm curious, is there something on red, or is it Are there like specific?
I don't know. I know there is one just about indigo.
Hmm.
And then there's another one about blue, about specifically about, they call it Pompeii blue or Egyptian blue. And it's called the rarest color that was lost to history. And it's about how it was this incredible achievement that was just somehow forgotten for centuries. I can't think of any that are about red specifically.
Someone
I would
in the chat-
imagine there must be, as red is, as we talked about last year, an incredibly significant color.
Yeah.
Oh,
People are putting in
someone
the
added
chat.
in indigo, the color that changed the world. That's the one I was thinking of, the one that's
I
just about
guess-
indigo.
Read by Spike Burkhoff.
The
Great.
one about indigo, the author has ancestors from West Africa. And so she does a really beautiful dive into that storyline of indigo in West Africa and then its proliferation in American culture through enslaved peoples.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Alison. And I do, if anyone else has any remaining questions, please feel free to chime in. We do still have some time. But I want to thank Alison for being here and the Harvard Art Museums for lending your expertise to us
Yeah, thank you so much.
for another round of blue. I guess we'll see you next year for red as well, hopefully.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you all so much.
And Erin, did you want to chime in?
No, but thank you. We did record this. I mentioned in the chat, I know some folks had some difficulty signing on, so we'll be sharing the recording link with everyone as soon as we have it up on YouTube. And thank you, Alison. Happy holidays, all. If you haven't been to see Blue, it's up until Friday. And you can come visit us
Thank
at 25
you.
Lowell Street.
I
thank you.
appreciate any chance to talk to people about how exciting pigments can be. So thanks so much for all coming and paying attention.
Thank you.
Bye.